A couple of new participants have joined us. My dear colleague, David Maris. Well, this is the afternoon session, and we have the second two of the dream team that I mentioned earlier. The first person to speak is Joe Whipple, who is known to many of you who are at Boston University. He is executive in residence from the Central Intelligence Agency and attached to the Department of International Relations. And we're delighted to have him. And I'm particularly delighted because as a college student, he studied history. And I'm a historian, and he's a historian as well as an active member of the agency. I'm not going to repeat all of Joe's achievements. They're in the handout that you got there. But I did just wanted to add, as I said about Art, is that both of these guys are just incredible teachers as well as practitioners. And it's just wonderful for the students in the department to have the opportunity to interact with people who have had practical experience but also can talk about it and can teach. And then after Joe makes his presentation, the next presenter will be Bridge Colby, who is currently on the adjunct staff of the RAND Corporation, member of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and has served as special assistant to the Chief of Staff, the officer of the Director of National Intelligence, and staff member on the Commission on Intelligence Capabilities of the United States. And Bridge is going to talk about the future of intelligence. So without further ado, I will turn the podium over to Joe Whipple.
I have to note before beginning that I am still an employee of CIA. So therefore, I have to tell you all that the opinions I express are my own. I'm also prohibited from saying anything critical of CIA. So if you hear anything critical, you heard wrong. Yes, I think in the questions, the conversation that began and the discussion that took place was all very, very interesting. I've had a career in the Directorate of Operations, with most of my career being overseas in Germany, Austria, Luxembourg, Spain, Guatemala, as well as Mexico. And I've also been on, the Ames Damage Assessment Team, among other things. The book, a lot has been said on the book. There's none that I really disagree with so far. But I'd like to note something, almost as in his author's note, at the very beginning. He writes, he's saying the book, describes how the most powerful country in the history of Western civilization has failed to create a first-rate spy service. And I was thinking to myself, when I was reading that, if you were to take a poll of former, retired, and present officers in the National Clandestine Service, whether they would agree or not with that. And I have a feeling a majority might agree. It could be first rate. It's not necessarily first rate. And I think he sort of has the answer within the sentence itself, and that's the most powerful country in the world. We can do a lot of things that don't have ultimate consequences, ultimately negative consequences, in my opinion, indefinitely in my opinion. We can send ambassadors who don't speak the language, We can send officers who don't speak the language. I've had a number of them in the various places that I've served in the world. You know, and this is kind of, it's an interesting thing. You go to Washington, D.C., none of the ambassadors from foreign countries would not be able to speak the language, or their intelligence officers, or generally that being the case. So there's a lot of things that we can do that no one else can do. Now, is there going to be a day of reckoning in that regard? Possibly. I don't know. But I think that's you know, that interests me very, very much. Also noted very strongly here is that, as Bill said, kind of there's a thread of moralism going through the book. But I find it to be a very shallow type of thread of moralism. Because I was on the Ames damage assessment team for a year, and if you don't know, Aldrich Ames was probably the most disastrous penetration of CIA in CIA's history. I read most of the books that were written about the Ames case, including one by Tim Weiner. It's a terrible book. It's a terrible book, like most of the books written about it. But as a matter of fact, there's a great book written about the Ames case. It's by Peter Early. And 90% of what Early says in that book is true. And that's not bad for a journalist to accomplish. But he, you know, said about giving himself the time that he needed to do so. I think, you know, in Legacy of Ashes, you could do that about a lot of institutions. You could do it about the Department of State. One of my best friends once said, you can be candid and you can be a member of the Department of State, but you can't be both. But you could do it about the New York Times. Heaven help us. I mean, I just read where our correspondent in Moscow in the 30s said there was no famine, as 5 million people are starving to death. He notes in the book how upset President Eisenhower was that we didn't get the proper assessment of Castro. Neither did Herbert Matthews of the Times, who gave us a terrible assessment of Robin Hood from Cuba. And that could even go on to the action in Iraq. I would say I have I start out with a bit of a premise. And my premise in this is that communism as a system really was never good for anybody. It provided a secret police, it took away freedoms, and it made people poor. So I'll start out with that basic proposition. There's been a lot of discussion on covert action, and he discusses it to a great extent. In Italy, both sides got involved in trying to, you know, support the winner. Was Italy better off because we supported democratic forces? Well, anybody who's been in Italy recently, as I was a few months ago, would say yes, they were better off. I think our support of free labor unions through the condominium of Lovestone and Brown and the AFL-CIO, I think was proper and helpful, as communism, I think, was basically an enemy of the working man. I think our support of the Center for Cultural Freedom, Malcolm Muggeridge once described it as CIA's contribution, comparing it to the Renaissance princes who supported the arts. And it would, I think, a person like Weiner would have probably done well to read the type of people who appeared in a magazine like Encounter. I believe that you know, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were worthwhile institutions to beam information into Central and Eastern Europe. Now, that is a good side. And I think one thing that's always very interesting about covert action, and having been involved in some covert action in my own career, that there is that business of what I call unintended consequences. I would be as negative as he was on our action in Iran with the trying to undermine the government of Mossadegh. And I think we did get payback for that. Guatemala is more complicated. It really is. I served in Guatemala during the Central American show, and I'm not all that sure that events turned out that badly. The Central American show, as a matter of fact, in the mid-1980s, was a covert action of tremendous dispute in this country. It had to do with Salvador, had to do with Honduras, had to do with Nicaragua. And eventually, the money was cut off. It resulted in Iran-Contra, which was a disaster, to say the least. But Central America, right now, is pretty quiet. Most of the countries are members of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Daniel Ortega is back, leading Nicaragua. I understand is so far as the only country that's recognized South Ossetia and the other, yes. Thank you, Igor. And the other great covert action program of the period, Afghanistan, had almost universal support in Congress, from left to right. Well, covert action, like all the actions in our lives, often have unintended consequences. But was it still important? Do I still think Afghanistan gains more pluses than minuses? And I would say it gains more pluses than minuses, because I think it was one of the many factors involved in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And do I think that was good? Yes, I do think that was good. And I do think Putin is a lot better than Stalin or Khrushchev or Brezhnev, although he's got a long way to go. Hopefully he'll make it. So I think the covert action thing is one of those tools that a president has, and a president that we all elect. If people were surprised that Ronald Reagan was going to have a certain type of policy, well, I don't know how you could be surprised. I really don't. You really know that he is going to have a different type of policy toward the Soviet Union than President Carter. So it can't be that much of a surprise. And after all, these are the people that are elected. And it's a tool that they use. As Senator Moynihan once said about President Carter woke up this morning and he found out, hey, it's my CIA. And so I think you have a situation where you cannot divide these people. And I think, Weiner does basically say that, but he really doesn't emphasize it. And if you were to write, I think, an honest book, you could write an honest revisionist book about U.S. policy from World War II until 1989. You could do that. And that would be part of it. But I think that basically that policy was pretty positive. It accomplished a lot. Policy since then, you might open up to questions and concerns. I think I'm trying to think of all the various incidents, extemporaneously. Certainly his description of the Ames case. A malcontent, he describes him as alcohol abuser who had was a poor performer. He describes him in that sense. that's really not true. He performed in some areas of what a case officer is supposed to perform at poorly. That is true. But in other areas, he performed very well. He was, after all, the handler of Fedorenko and the backup case officer to Shevchenko, which he did extremely well. His problem basically was that he was not a good assessor, developer, or recruiter of agents. He just couldn't do that. And ultimately, the reason why he turned against his country and CIA was for money. He just needed the money. He just couldn't save the money. That's as simple as it gets. I've thought a lot about this in these CI cases. I think somebody has counted up the number of spies we've had since World War II at 179. My memory may be off a little bit on that. That's in the context of millions of employees of the various national security agencies, the military, NSA, and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very small percentage. It's like 0.001%, or you put even some more zeros there, and you'll get a person who becomes a spy for someone else. But boy, is it embarrassing. And I wonder if we're more afraid of being embarrassed than of being productive. Do we really care if we're not productive, or is it just the embarrassment factor that bothers us? And time again, I've seen that. In the Ames case, it was a regular rumble, and mistakes were made at the agency regarding the Ames case, especially not in informing Congress beforehand. That should have happened. But on the other hand, if you're into a spy agency or into HUMINT, you will always have this. It's a statistical thing. We've had it, the Germans have had it, the Russians have had it, the French have had it, the British have had it. It's just part of the business. And often the political problem that occurs is that there's then a lack of leadership. When something like this happens, there's no leadership. There's nobody says, well, this is part of it. If you don't want to be embarrassed, then don't get into HUMINT. It is impossible not to be embarrassed. And that's the difference between SIGINT and HUMINT. That's why a lot of people love SIGINT. Just to be able to read a conversation is great, instead of having an agent. One of my best friends, actually a great counterintelligence officer, and what do you need to be a counterintelligence officer? You do have to be a little bit, you have to love detail, and you have to be a little paranoid. And he describes agent handling this way. Every agent's got a big button on his chest that says self-destruction. And your job is to make sure he doesn't press it. Not so easy. Why? Because they're human beings. Because they make mistakes. And case officers make mistakes. And every time that there is a lack of intelligence on any particular issue, the first thing you hear from Congress is more HUMINT. It's the first thing you hear. And when there's a compromise, and the New York Times can make fun of the compromise, why didn't they know? How could they not know that this person drank too much? When 10% of any organization drinks too much. You're sitting in front of a congressional committee trying to explain that. It's very, very hard. What's HUMINT all about? He doesn't go into any of those type of issues. But HUMINT is about meeting somebody who's 28 years old working for another government, and has no particular access. And 10 years later, he's got more access. And another 10 years later, he's doing something that nobody else can do for you, because maybe he's in North Korea. And 10 years after that, he might be next to his foreign minister. But for every one you get like that, you'll have 9 who never get anywhere, and you'll have 1 who talks to too many people. I don't believe in the polygraph either, but one time I remember doing a polygraph with an agent. At the end of it, I threw the telephone book at him and I said, "Is there anybody you didn't tell?" It's hard not to tell. It's very hard not to tell. You know, so the whole human complex, and I think there is a big ethical component to this, by the way. And what always surprises people is that you don't treat agents like snitches. I mean, you establish relations with agents. You keep them safe to the best of your ability, and so on, and you work with them. But some of the weaknesses, he really doesn't go into it. Language is a weakness, but it's not just in Arabic, Chinese, Dari, and Persian. It's generally across the board, and I think that's somewhat of an American issue. It's also an issue of being in a place long enough to really get to know it and to understand it. Someone asked about the number of directors. There have been a lot of directors. I tried to note down how many directors and deputy directors of the Directorate of Operations we've had in the last 30 years, and now called the National Clandestine Service. I'm around 30. Why do we do that? Because we can do it. Because we're powerful enough to do it. You know, is that coming to an end? Maybe. I used to, by the way, going to congressional. I was also director of congressional affairs, and hearing the congressional people always ask that same question: are you recruiting enough Arabic speakers and Persian speakers? And I felt like yelling back, hell, we don't have enough Spanish, French, Italian, Russian, and German speakers. We could use some more of those. And where are you going to meet an Iranian? Not in Tehran. Paris? Yeah. I mean, that's the places you meet these type of people. So there's real issues there, but it's something that often enough you get the feeling that the real issues are not what you really want to talk about, because that might mean real change. You know, so you tend not to want to get into things like that. Discussed at some length the security issues, and you know, one of the things that I've heard this, if your uncle happens to be in the let's say, just throw out the Pakistani intelligence service, you'll never get hired. That's the reason I'd want to hire him. You know, because his uncle is a member of the. And so you start out with the basic proposition that if you're a U.S. citizen, you are loyal. But remember something: one of these guys goes bad, and a ton of bricks will fall on these people. Why didn't you know? Recently, there was the example, actually, since I've been here, of the woman who I guess went through a sham marriage to get her citizenship. I think she may have been Lebanese. I can't remember exactly. But she then went to work, I think, first for the FBI and then CIA. And immediately it was, how could you let that happen? How could the FBI let that happen? Well, they let it happen. As I understand it, she was a terrific employee. and an employee worth having and maintaining and keeping and nurturing, and so on. So I think on this particular issue, you always gotta remember those both sides of the equation, and that when a problem develops, that often enough there isn't that leadership there, to state, yes, this was worth it, and this is why we did it, and we're going to continue to do it because it's the right thing to do. Because you can bet on it, as Professor Hulnick said, that if it's a failure, it'll be on the front page of the New York Times. Not their own failures, but everybody else's failures. So I think that's an issue certainly worth noting. He goes very quickly over the last phases of the intelligence, CIA's, the history of CIA, especially since the end of the Cold War and the administration of George H.W. Bush. I think he does an interesting. Some of the things that he doesn't do are interesting. He doesn't note, for instance, the tremendous decline in capability for the agency during the Clinton years, in which not only analysis but operations was cut severely, especially operations overseas, operational stations overseas. Africa was literally decimated. We were down to a handful of people in very important places like Indonesia, Nigeria, and so on. Europe got substantial cuts. About the only place that wasn't cut substantially was the Near East Division. And so they took all those cuts. So you lose capability when that happens. But he seems to. That's one of those things. I guess he just kind of wants to ignore. In that context, if you want successful espionage, I mean, you have to have a forward-looking global view. You simply cannot just have, on your plate the issues that the policymaker wants dealt with at that point in time. That doesn't mean that you don't accede to the policymaker's wishes. You have to. And I would say right now, guessing, that pretty much all our national security institutions are fixated on Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran. And that there are a lot of areas of the world that will become important in the future, in that 10, 20, and 30 years, future, that we are neglecting. If we had wanted sources on Iraq, we should have started 40 years ago. Is Iraq important? Well, it has the second largest reserves of oil in the world. It's in a key spot in the Middle East. This isn't rocket science. Not rocket science to me. Yesterday we had in the International Relations Department a group coming in from South America, a couple people from Brazil. Well, I'll tell you, Brazil is important. And intelligence isn't just about your enemies. Intelligence is knowing things and understanding things for the policymaker. That is, if the policymaker learns. And actually, they do. We've noted we can't get into too many details on these type of things. But I'll tell you, starting out and when I was still, before management, when I really still had to work for a living, during the Reagan and Carter administrations, I found that they learned. And they learned through a combination of embassy and CIA reporting. They changed policies when they were confronted with facts. You're not going to change this country's view because they're going to go ahead with it. So live with it. And I think I actually have seen it change policy. I've seen it bring about correct decisions in Washington, D.C. I think the deployment issue in Western Europe during the late 70s and early 80s had a lot of CIA, embassy, Defense Department, and other reporting that established a position that was then carried out very successfully. So as a matter of fact, it does happen. They do listen. Other administrations don't listen as well, but those two actually did, and I think that's worth knowing, and worth understanding. So I think probably my final comments, because the questions are usually very good, and certainly listening to the questions were excellent. You do have a situation once in a while where you do wonder about things like accountability. And I've served on accountability boards. And that seems to be maybe the most difficult area for an intelligence agency to deal with, in the sense that it doesn't want to, really necessarily confront mistakes and put a name on mistakes. The tendency is to look at it and then kind of sometimes to circle the wagons. If it gets to Congress, it can be very partisan. And at the end of the day, as a couple of, I can hear their voices ringing in my ear, a couple of U.S. senators said, "We have to go on." What that usually means to me is, we don't want to figure out what happened. I think sometimes there's a need to kind of figure out what happened. And there are some issues that, for an operations officer like myself, reading this, I certainly knew about the issue that he brings up, in which he's got his dates wrong, but beginning about from 1989 to 1994, intelligence was passed to the Department of Defense, which we knew was controlled. Now, when I first heard this, I was on the Ames Damage Assessment team. I did not believe it. I didn't believe it because, one of the really, it's a matter of your integrity is that you report accurately. And I know who did it. He wasn't quite like James Jesus Angleton, but another, one of these nutty cases who got himself into a position of authority and did this on his own authority, bypassing the chief of the CE division, who was at that time Milt Bearden. And it's one of those things that should have gotten a name. Another example that he uses, that Tim Weiner uses, I find it's a fascinating example because I'd both served in Guatemala and I was a member of the Accountability Board. And this was later on when the station had recruited a Guatemalan colonel. Let me tell you something. Stay away from Guatemalan colonels. They're bad news. They all have mustaches and they're great dancers, but I'll tell you, they're bad, they'll get you into trouble. Now, the idea on recruiting this Guatemalan colonel and paying him was gradually we'll get more control over him. You think Guatemalan colonels are easy to control? None that I've met. And this guy, as described in the book, got involved in human rights violations of an American citizen. He neglected to say was one of our agents who told us about that. He neglected to say that. So what do you think we eventually did? We got rid of all our agents. Nobody will ever get in trouble with Congress if they say they didn't know when they didn't know. No, it won't happen. And most of those places, by the way, and this was also in the 90s, were shut down in Central America. So we basically don't have any sources on Central America. Is Central America a danger to us? Well, it's not a danger to us, but I mean, there's a big counter-narcotics, issue there, and organized crime issue, and so on. And I think gradually they are, again, increasing their presence beyond a minimum. But, that's, human is, it can be a very subtle type of thing, and that shows it. But it also shows that this kind of, and I find that as I've mentioned, that ongoing switching of jobs, that ongoing carousel that we have, especially in the espionage field, is not very good, because people don't really get to know the areas that they're working in and the type of people that they're working with. And I think you need a lot of expertise to do this type of job. But it's also something, again, that we really, we really don't like. We had General Barno here to talk to us. He had been our commander in Afghanistan, and he noted with some chagrin that he was one of the, in a 5-year period, there were 4 commanders there. 4 commanders? Come on. But I'll tell you what happens. You go one place, you go to another. It's kind of a career type of thing, and sometime or other, I think it's very important for not only CIA, but other government agencies to combine mission with career instead of separating them. So you follow a career, but it gets sort of divorced from a mission. And you'll have one of our best French speakers as, chief of station in Germany. I'm making that up. That happens all the time. Happens all the time. And not just with us. Not just with us. So I think there's a lot of reason to have a critique, but I think it has to be a lot more broad-based than anything Tim Weiner has produced. He notes in there that we should get back to espionage. And I agree. But he doesn't have one thing in there that would help you get there. Not one thing. He has in there, actually, it's not a bad quote. And also I want to quote something that, one of my favorite quotes. I've heard this quote before, and I'll digress a little bit, but this is from Lyndon Johnson. Let me tell you about these intelligence guys. When I was growing up in Texas, we had a cow named Bessie. I'd go out early and milk her. I'd get her in a stanchion, seat myself, and squeeze out a pail of fresh milk. One day I'd worked hard and gotten a full pail of milk, but I wasn't paying attention, and old Bessie swung her shit-smeared tail through the bucket of milk. Now, that's what these intelligence guys do. You work hard and get a good program or policy going, and they swing a shit-smeared tail through it. That's a little bit about what intelligence is supposed to do. It's supposed to go up and tell the president, these are the facts. These are the facts. And the fact of the matter is they don't like to hear that necessarily. And that's always going to be somewhat of a problem for intelligence agencies, for the Directorate of Operations and the Analytical Directorate. I'll also quote another quote from him. This is not bad. The new commander-in-chief must restore American principles in the long war. I don't like the term long war, but that's all right. That means renouncing torture, returning habeas corpus to its rightful place in American law, closing Guantanamo and shutting secret prisons. It means limiting the state secrets privilege by which presidents block American courts from administering justice. I don't have, any objection, to that at all, as a matter of fact. But again, it's kind of that, it's a little bit like Deus Ex Machina up there, just kind of making fun of a lot of things that he really doesn't understand or want to understand. But given the global responsibilities of our country in the past, and I think in the future as well, maybe in a more limited role than we have, it means that we have to have good intelligence, and then I think it has to result in a little bit of a change of our own reference of the way the U.S. and its people and its institutions and Tim Weiner are. And it's this a little bit. The American people are ambivalent about intelligence. It's something that's kind of actually Steve Cull in his book Ghost Wars, which is a very good book, describes that as a little bit of a characteristic that President Clinton had. And I think it's there, but yeah, I think good leadership and good judgment within intelligence agency can kind of right itself, so that indeed we are out there, or intelligence is out there, providing the policymaker with the facts. We don't make policy. The policy can do whatever he wants. Basically, and often and usually do. But it's our job to do the very best, and that is only possible by looking ahead, by looking ahead a long ways, because if you want assets or people who are telling you what's going on, people who are trying to help you understand what's going on, you got to start real early. It's not like, a faucet that all of a sudden you just open and say, oh, okay, now we get intelligence on Brazil. It's not going to happen. So I think that's something that he should be aware of and conscious of. So I think because the questions are usually so good, I'll just end there. And
Thanks very much.
yeah.
Rich, it's yours.
Well, tough act to follow. It's an honor to be on a panel with such a distinguished group of people. I'll just note that this is a great illustration of the rule that the longer a person's bio, the less distinguished he is. Mine is the longest bio. Obviously, I can't really compete with the other panelists in terms of their knowledge and experience, so I thought what I would do is use Tim Weiner's book as a starting point, but talk about some of the intelligence issues that I've been thinking about and have worked on, and also the connection with broader policy issues. Hopefully that'll be of interest. I want to take as a starting point two of Tim Weiner's key statements. First, that the United States has failed to create a first-rate spy service, and that this failure constitutes a danger to the national security of the United States. And second, that the war we are now in will last as long as the Cold War, and we will win or lose by virtue of our intelligence. This is the concluding line of his book. I want to dispute these assessments, specifically that our intelligence community has failed in a meaningful and material sense of the word failed, and is failing, and more importantly, that intelligence will play such a central role in the security of the United States over the next generation. Let me sketch out my argument for you. Contrary to popular understanding, I believe intelligence is actually quite limited in what it can provide to governments. The limits of intelligence are both inherent and conceptual as well as practical. Because intelligence is so limited in what it can do, national security strategies that place excessive reliance on intelligence are unlikely to succeed and may well be seriously irresponsible. An appropriate and effective national security strategy will therefore place less of an emphasis on intelligence. My argument is that a strategy founded more on deterrence, as well as incorporating other strategies, is therefore the most appropriate. I want to emphasize that I don't want to overstate the case here. Intelligence remains critically important, But as a matter of national security strategy going forward, a more limited understanding of what intelligence can do is vital. And this is one that is radically different from Tim Weiners, and also, I believe, a popular understanding that you see in the Congress and the press as well. I believe this will give us a framework for thinking about intelligence. We're going to be living in a world of scarce and probably increasingly scarce resources. So rationales for prioritizing and allocating resource decisions are central. In fact, U.S. defense and intelligence budgets will likely have to plateau over the coming years, especially in light of national fiscal crises and coming recession. We simply cannot afford to spend indiscriminately. We need to direct our efforts and our resources towards the most pressing issues and where that marginal extra dollar is going to be most effective on intelligence. So let me sketch out the first part of my argument, the limits of intelligence. We need to be realistic about what intelligence can do. There is no radical transformation that is going to get us an order of magnitude different level of intelligence. The nature of international competition among states competing against one another means that the future really can't be tamed. It can't be settled and predicted. Uncertainty is an irremovable part of this system. We can't reliably, as Weiner says that we must on the first page of his book, demand that the CIA anticipate surprise. The really deepest point about this is a conceptual or inherent one. That is that the nature of international competition, and this is suggested, I think, by traditional political thought, game theory, history, and other disciplines, shows that political competition among states is an inherently fluid dynamic. There are no magic rubrics that will predict the future beyond the sort of platitude. International politics is a contest, a competition among willful and intelligent actors who are always reacting and relating to each other. Many actors will have the incentive to upend predictions and assumptions, even at some cost to themselves. Thus, the international scene should be seen as inherently non-linear and subject to a great deal of uncertainty and unpredictability. The intelligence community should not and cannot be expected to get beyond this, nor should it try. Instead, the government needs to plan for uncertainty and risk, for surprise. Intelligence needs to factor this ambiguity in, not seek to remove it. If it does, this will only boomerang and we will get bit on the behind. This is actually a point, I think, that cuts against the grain of the founding analytical approach of the CIA, which was born in the 1940s and 50s, which is sort of the height of intellectual confidence in central planning and the ability of the social sciences to predict and control human behavior. Instead, the community's analytic attitude should take an increased appreciation for the profoundly complex, unpredictable, and even enigmatic quality of human interactions. I think this is a view that has been receiving increased appreciation in various fields over recent decades. That said, it's a very old insight. Some of the classical authors talked about it. But I think the best exponent is Clausewitz in his On War. More recently, though, the failure of central planning in the socialist economy seems to illustrate the point quite well. But on the other hand, in other fields, I think that developments like the rise of chaos theory, an increased appreciation for the fundamental unpredictability of phenomena in physics, and so forth, suggest that this is a view that's gaining increasing traction. The bottom line is that we are fundamentally pretty limited in how well we can predict the future, especially when that future involves human beings competing with each other. It's probably artificial to give specific examples of this very general and broad dynamic, but let me just mention a few to give you some sense of what I mean. One case I've looked at in particular is the 1973 Yom Kippur War, in which Egypt surprised Israel with a surprise attack that led to a couple of weeks of war. The reality, though, was that the Israelis actually had a pretty good understanding, as did we, of the disposition of the Egyptian forces. What President Sadat of Egypt was able to do was take advantage of Israeli expectations and lull Israel into a strategic surprise by playing on what they thought that Egypt would do under their predictions, and given the balance of forces, Israeli conventional supremacy. I think, as Clausewitz repeatedly pointed out, you can see this dynamic very much in the behavior of France during the revolutionary and especially Napoleonic period. Napoleon himself was a classic exponent of this approach, as was, I think, unfortunately, for the bad, but was Hitler, who was very adept at manipulating the expectations of his opponents, particularly the Western democracies, but Stalin as well. To take advantage of what we wanted or what we expected, how people should behave in a kind of Kellogg-Briand world. And that was with the Rhineland and the Austrian and the Sudeten crises are all examples of that. And I think today, actually, the Chinese are probably following something like this, though more probably from this kind of Sun Tzu perspective than from a Western tradition, but I think this is what they're thinking as well. Let me emphasize, though, that I'm not saying that everything is like a black box. Certain predictions can be reasonably ventured, but these must always be fairly general and subject to contingency. They're plausible predictions. They're not hard and fast rules. So good strategic planning must factor this uncertainty in order to make the kinds of predictions that are possible. They're plausible ones, likely, but always tenuous. The point is to know the limits of what we can do. So the bottom line on this conceptual point is that there are very strict inherent limits on the degree to which we can predict the future. What you might think of as the question, what will Saddam do? Will Saddam use, if you think he has WMD, will he use WMD? Will he invade? You know, he may not even know. There isn't really necessarily a right answer, and whatever you think that right answer is, he'll respond to. But then there's a sort of more practical point that the other speakers, I think in particular, have touched on, which is just secrecy. And this pertains more to the question of, well, does Saddam Hussein have WMD? A more practical question that we want to know about as well. But this gets to the point that the issues, the information that the intelligence community is looking for are those that states and non-state actors are hiding most assiduously. The intelligence community is generally and appropriately uninterested in the obvious. It needs to find out about weapons programs, leadership intentions, intelligence operations, etc. These are by their very nature well concealed. That's the definition. They need to be well concealed in order to be effective. So this makes answering that question of what is Iran doing or what is North Korea doing now very difficult to answer. And this is, I think, something that Weiner consistently underestimates. And I think a great example that we've touched on a number of times is the performance of the CIA and also other allied spy services. Weiner never compares U.S. performance to, say, the British and the French. I mean, comparatively, the U.S. did quite well. The French and the Germans were just completely penetrated, as were the British. So, you know, who's counting here, right? You got to baseline your analysis. But that said, the CIA had enormous amount of difficulty going after the Soviet Union and its allies. But these were regimes that were constructed on the basis of security and secrecy. I mean, it's worth remembering that the Soviets constructed entire secret cities for their strategic programs. I mean, these were not even on the map, right? Further, under the Stalin regime in particular, the Soviets murdered millions of their own citizens on the trumped-up pretext that they were spies for the capitalist powers. I mean, as the much more experienced intelligence officers point out, this is just you're not gonna break in here. And I think Weiner actually, I mean, at least with any frequency, Weiner actually sort of concedes this at one point. I can't remember the page, but he says, quotes an agency officer saying, well, you know, to really understand what was going on in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, we would have had to recruit a member of the Politburo. You know, you're not reliably going to recruit a member of the Politburo. And I think, you know, it's also worth noting that the great assets that the West enjoyed, that got, were mostly walk-ins, and they often had limited shelf life. So intelligence can't really expect it to be anywhere near omniscient. Indeed, we should rather plan that it will miss many, if not actually most, of the events and trends that we want to know about. This is definitely not because of the ineptitude or malevolence of intelligence personnel. Weiner has this habit of kind of attributing to people's malevolence and stupidity and drunkenness, like all these difficulties the CIA had, which is, I find, very annoying. And you would think that if you've got thousands and thousands of people over time, he would think maybe it's not that they're all drunks, right? But he apparently doesn't want to look at that possibility. Instead, I think these limits arise because of the inherent unpredictability of target behavior, combined with the often effectively impenetrable opacity that the community has to grapple with. Let me talk a little bit from my own experience. I worked for a year on the WMD Commission, which was tasked by the president in February 2005 to see what had gone wrong with the intelligence on Iraq. So I worked on a three-person team, and we interviewed tons of people in the intelligence community to see what happened. What I came away with was that, and the commission reported, is that the intelligence community reasonably assessed that Saddam Hussein was reconstituting his WMD programs. They based this on his erratic and secretive behavior, his past actions, the reports of defectors, etc. These all seem to support the estimate that he was working to rebuild a WMD program. That would make sense for him. It would allow him to deter the U.S., which was sort of bombing him occasionally, the Iranians, who he'd fought a war with, the Israelis, who he didn't like, etc., and maybe even to try to, you know, pull something off like Kuwait in the future. The intelligence community had an enormous amount of difficulty penetrating Iraq. It was a super closed society. I think it's worth noting that, as the Dulfer report pointed out, the only person who may have really known whether Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction was Saddam himself. And to be honest, he may not even have known. So IC analysts had vanishingly little to work with. And so they made a reasoned assessment that he was up to no good. But here's where the problem came in, and I think the community lost its sense of the limits here. the assessment kind of snowballed in or calcified into something that became resistant to disverification. They lost that sort of sense of being nimble and open to new evidence. So, for instance, they wouldn't look at reports from defectors or sources who said there weren't WMD. So that's where you have to maintain this sense of limits. But the bottom line is that they did make a reasonable assessment. The error was in being too confident about what was ultimately an inference based on some pretty slim data. But the story is never simple. Iraq is in one direction, but it's not the only failure. 9/11 is a failure in the other direction. There, the CIA was early and often, and I think to its credit, blowing the horn on the al-Qaeda threat. But analysts there, as well as at other agencies like the FBI, which seems to always get away with these, its reputation seems to be okay consistently. But they didn't put the pieces together, right? The opposite problem from Iraq. But as Richard Posner has pointed out very well, I think, in anticipation of 9/11, as someone else has pointed out, the pieces weren't clear. There was no necessary connection. So it's the reverse problem. So again, there's some real limits about what can be assessed. A third reason for the limits of intelligence is simply, I think, organizational. And Joe Whipple's talked about this in particular. And this limits all arms of government. You can assume that organizations have perfect information, transparency, efficiency, and so forth. But one of the nice things about having worked in the government is a little bit is you see that this is not at all how things happen. And it's not because, again, people are dumb. It's the nature of things. James Q. Wilson, in his book Bureaucracy, I think is the best thing I've read on this subject. I mean, I can give you an example here, just looking at the history. The agency's line on Iran, the agency regularly gets knocked on Iran, and maybe rightfully. But one of the reasons for this was that there was a very experienced, very solid, very well-regarded analyst on the topic who'd been working the Iran issue for a long time. But he was very tethered to a certain line, to a certain perspective. And he got surprised by the fall of the Shah. The Shah was much weaker than he was. So that's a sort of organizational blot. But let's look at another country that, for a great example of this. This is the Soviet Union, which consistently, even though it had a great spy service, it didn't really have a good intelligence service because it didn't really know how to process intelligence. Fundamentally, intelligence is trying to make good decisions based on the data, right? But the Soviet had a great spy, a German spy against the Germans in Japan named George Sorga, who basically gave Stalin warning that they were about to be invaded by the Germans, and Stalin ignored him because he didn't want to hear it. And that's sort of that kind of connects to this political issue that fundamentally the intelligence community, there's organization within the bureaucracy, but then there's ultimately there's a political master. And one of the things I learned in my time in the government is that our system of government is not designed to maximize efficiency. And I think that was quite deliberate, and we should be happy about it because it protects our freedoms. But it is not designed to work well. I was working for Director Negroponte when the New York Times revealed the terror surveillance program, the domestic wiretapping program, and General Michael Hayden, who is his number two, who is more or less supposed to be managing the intelligence community on a day-to-day basis, basically spent 100% of his time for several months just dealing with Congress, care and feeding on this issue. And whatever you think about the right or wrongness of this issue or whatever, it's not efficient if the manager of the intelligence community is spending all his time talking to the Congress. So this has a lot of costs. So these are the three main, I think, at least three of the main reasons why intelligence is so limited. Well, what are the implications of these limits? It's well and good to talk about this, but what does it mean? Well, I think the first is the infeasibility or danger of strategies that put too much emphasis on intelligence. These, I think, are going to be generally imprudent, and this applies both to hawkish and dovish approaches. This I think your antenna should go up then when you see calls for much better intelligence being part of somebody's national security proposal or an intelligence transformation. The hawks will be calling for much more risk-taking and risk-tolerant human operations. Why aren't the case officers actually inserting themselves into al-Qaeda? As if that's really plausible, right? And on the left, yeah, right. On the left, you see people saying, oh, well, if we had better intelligence on Iran and North Korea and on the proliferation and terrorism problems, then we'd be fine. But the reality is, you can't be too hawkish. I mean, this is the preventive strategy associated with the Bush administration circa 2002. that sees proliferation as an unacceptable threat and advocates preventive actions as a sort of rule, including war, to stop proliferation and other threatening dynamics. But I think as the Iraq imbroglio has showed, but more generally as well, this either places unrealistic demands on intelligence for finding stuff out, or sets such a low bar for taking action that it would basically implicate us in continual warfare, which, for a variety of reasons, I don't think is a good idea. But then on the dovish side as well, it's not realistic as well, because there the hope is to vest more authority in the international community and move towards disarmament. But this places enormously improbable demands on intelligence to detect cheating, and simply punts the question of how to deal with problem actors, right? Because many on the left, for instance, say that we should have waited until the inspectors found out what was going on with Iraq. I completely agree with this, right? That seems like a no-brainer. But it simply kicks the can down the road, right? What if the inspectors had found, or the intelligence community had found WMD? We see this question with Iran now. Do you punish a proliferator, or do you, what if the international community can't come to some kind of peaceful solution? The reality is that intelligence is not a substitute for policy on either side. It can tell you what's going on, sort of, but it won't address the underlying problem. So we should be planning for uncertainty and surprise. We need to assume that states and non-state actors of concern, as well as, frankly, our allies probably, will deliberately seek to surprise us and take advantage of our blind spots. They're going to be looking at how what our trajectory is, and they're going to be looking to make the best position based on that. I think a classic example of this is the reaction of key states like China, Russia, India, and others to U.S. military dominance over the last 15 years, driven by the revolution in military affairs. You see these countries, instead of developing weapons symmetrically with the United States, instead of developing the same kind of weapons on their own, which would play to our advantages because we could always just keep in front of them, rival states are concentrating their efforts in areas where our supremacy can be undermined. So you see with the Chinese shooting down one of our satellites, a great example of this, as well as the Russians' work on cyber, the ability to hit the web. They're looking for vulnerable nodes. They're looking to see where we're going and then to take advantage of it. This situation basically has also, perversely in a way, given an incentive to our rivals to go both under through terrorism and insurgency, as well as over through nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction to attack our supremacy. So there are limits to intelligence, and our adversaries and rivals and other actors are going to try to take advantage of this. So what do we do? What does this mean? How can we make the best of these limits and still craft a good security strategy? Clearly, the right national security strategy has to take these limits into account. In my view, the basic strategy or strategic orientation that takes this reality into account most appropriately is one that ultimately emphasizes a deterrent posture, while, of course, incorporating a variety of options. You always say, well, all elements of national power. Why is a deterrent strategy well suited to these limits? In my view, deterrence requires less from intelligence. It asks less. It does this by moderating the importance of predictive or warning intelligence, or really intelligence in general, anticipating surprise, or really finding out what the opponent is doing, while placing more emphasis on forensics and identification in order to enable retaliation. Deterrence basically, the general posture basically says, we're going to be watching you, we're going to keep tabs, we're going to try to prevent bad things, but ultimately, we're going to say, if you really want to do something and we can't figure it out, ultimately it rests on, if you attack us, there will be consequences. This basically means that it rests on the credible threat of retaliation against those who strike at us or our interests. In my view, this is the best policy for an uncertain and inherently risky world. Ultimately, deterrence is usually associated with our nuclear forces, and I strongly believe that these are the ultimate grounding of our security and our deterrent. And there's a letter just released by the Secretaries of Defense and Energy that's a very good statement on this, about 20 pages long. But it's not only, fortunately, not like in the Eisenhower administration. So we have a much stronger and flexible deterrent that is added from our conventional forces, our alliances, our counter-terror capabilities, our diplomacy, and our intelligence capabilities, which means that our enemies don't really necessarily know what we know, so that imposes costs and risks on them. But basically everything that contributes to the capability to retaliate against strikes and that visibly manifests our will to do so. Of Of course, this has got to be combined with policies of what's called dissuasion, assurance of allies and neutrals, and war-winning capabilities if need be. But I think deterrence, correctly postured, supported, and exercised, provides a cap on the violence that is likely to be done to the United States and its vital interests by making such aggression clearly incommensurate with whatever purposes the attacker had in mind, even if your intelligence isn't that good, which should, I think, argue against what Tim Weiner says at the end of his book. Thus, even though the U.S., in my view, probably, quote-unquote, lost the great game of espionage to the Soviets and the Cubans, who seem to routinely have run rings around us, it ultimately didn't matter because the Soviets reasoned that aggression wasn't worth the risk of our and our allies' response to real aggression. Today, it is widely accepted that a deterrence calculus would apply to major states like China and Russia, although some people don't agree with that. But I argue that it also applies, though potentially with more difficulty, to regional states of concern like Iran and North Korea, and even to terrorists, especially through a more imaginative and expansive deterrent policy. The U.S. will need to develop the appropriate capabilities and act appropriately in the international arena to enable deterrence. It's not going to be easy, but it can be done. So what's the role of intelligence in this deterrence strategy? Well, it's a more modest one than a preemption or a dovish strategy would have, but it's also more realistic. The primary underlying role of intelligence in this view is sort of what I call forensics and identification. The chief role of intelligence has to be to identify the source of an attack and enable proper retaliation. Because deterrence, and therefore retaliation, is the cornerstone of our security and our guarantee to our allies and those who rely on us, the intelligence community must be able to identify the sources of strikes, kind of kinetic or otherwise, against ourselves and against those whom we protect, and also to locate targets to retaliate against. In reality, this function, though, despite its centrality, really shouldn't consume a very large proportion of resources, largely because the task is very specific and directed. You only need to look at a few things, and basically you're saying, well, we're going to choose how to retaliate. Furthermore, this reality has actually been in force since the post-World War II era, when deterrence did become the foundation of our security. So it wouldn't be that radical of a change. In some ways, it would be a shift back to a Cold War perspective in some ways, when the chief role of the intelligence community and also the military fundamentally was the focus on Soviet strategic forces and their movements. The key role then, and this is why Weiner doesn't talk about these too much, but these big estimates on Soviet strategic forces and how we could, how we were tracking them, this was really the central role, the great game. Other things were important and were ways to compete, but they were limited wars. The key role for the intelligence community was to track these nuclear forces and to track targets in order to enable retaliation. Thus, and this is and people have talked about this, Art Holnick talked about this a lot, and I think very, very well, correctly. Weiner's book, and you always hear about CIA human. You hear about how these things are so much, right? But the key elements of U.S. intelligence, the Cold War, in my view, were really the technical ones. The deployment of the U-2 and then the other overhead capabilities increased by orders of magnitude our understanding of Soviet strategic deployments, thus increasing our confidence in our deterrent, our ability to hit them back and also see if they were coming in against us. And thus, in turn, ultimately allowing us to make arms control agreements with them and to live more, give us more confidence in our ability to deal with them. This, I think, explains why, though the U.S. may have been defeated in the great game of espionage, it didn't necessarily matter that much. As long as the U.S. could credibly threaten to hold the Soviet Union at grave nuclear peril, not just obliterating the world, but be able to escalate up in a way that would make sense, and knew how to do it pretty well with good intelligence, the margins provided by most human coups were not that great. Again, this is not to underestimate the importance of a lot of the intelligence efforts, particularly those that did pertain to strategic forces and their survivability. These were really dangerous, nor certainly, of course, the history of the intelligence services, which are well known. It is simply to put it in perspective. So in today's context, I think the CIA's identification and retaliation role in a deterrence strategy would be exemplified, for instance, by our need to go get bin Laden. In order for the U.S. to maximize its deterrent in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and thereby help to deter future such attacks, we must find and retaliate against bin Laden, al-Zawahiri, and the other guys who were involved in this plot against our country, as well as for very valid reasons of justice and so forth. My view, actually, the failure to do this, perhaps even more than Iraq, which is a disaster enough, but the failure to get bin Laden is a true black mark on our national security, well, not on our national security structure, but on our government and our country over the last 7 years. So you've got this forensics and identification level. The second part is warning and prevention. This emphasis on the limits of intelligence doesn't mean we have to be ignoramuses, and it doesn't entail an abandonment of the warning and prevention functions. The warning has to remain a central part of the intelligence community. This pertains to terrorist groups, state actors, etc. Most of the community's resources will probably be consumed by this function, or many of them. And of course, the intelligence community needs to give the president the option to know enough to use prevention or preemption as an option always. The key is that these tools will be backstopped by deterrent threats and that they will ultimately take a secondary role in terms of resources and emphasis. We can't pour our resources endlessly this way because there are inherent limits to what we can achieve. We need to put the resources where they add the most at the margin. With more warning and prevention, in my view, diminishing marginal returns do kick in big time in excessively preventive or dovish strategies. I think strategic warning, which you see the National Intelligence Council doing recently with its 2025 exercise, is particularly important. The community is the only place where you can get all the classified information and at least the access, especially, and this is to be commended, working with outside academia and so forth, is the only place where you can get classified and unclassified information coming together with really smart people. You should have these people thinking and saying, okay, what's going out 20, 25 years? What's going out, 10 years? What's going to happen in Asia, blah, blah, blah. This can give policymakers who are only interested in the next couple of days a chance, all right, here's something where I need to put a little time or resources. And then, of course, the intelligence community will always need to provide support to the government's military, diplomatic and political functions, public diplomacy, and so forth, as well as enabling covert action capabilities. But I think as has been pointed out well, the covert action capability has such blowback possibilities that we need to be chary about using this. So this is at a very high level, but I thought I'd give some intelligence issues that the next president might achieve. So I worked in the administration, or not in the government through 2006. So I saw the beginning of the intelligence reform effort, watched that from the commission, and then inside working for the director of national intelligence, Negroponte, which I'd be happy to talk about if people are interested. But let me give you some of the key things that I think that the next DNI, the next president, the next national security leadership should focus on. Well, first is continuing intelligence reform. A major focus for the next president should be to continue to push for institutional change and development in the intelligence community, including through good use of the DNI. This does not mean more moving boxes. There's been enough organizational shifting probably for a while. But it does mean a continued leadership emphasis at the highest levels of government on creating a more integrated and effective community. This sounds kind of banal, but let me be a little more specific. I think that the leadership should try to encourage what the military calls a more purple attitude, more cooperation among the intelligence agencies. I'm not sure I really agree with Professor Holnick about cooperation in the old days. I think there certainly was cooperation, but there wasn't the sustained and institutionalized structural cooperation that is more necessary now than it probably was in the Cold War. The community seems to have developed very much in light of Cold War needs, and we have a different strategic picture today. 9/11 is a signal negative example of failures of institutional cooperation. These problems are actually, I think, depressingly simple. They're often related to deep cultural organizational instincts, incentive structures, and even physical location. I mean, people at Fort Meade at the National Security Agency just don't live with people who live in Langley, so they don't know them. They're different types of people. They don't socialize together. So it's, sometimes they're kind of relatively banal things. But ameliorating these problems will demand senior and sustained attention from the intelligence community leadership. I think the security example is a great example. Security people, I've had that experience myself where these people hold a lot of discretion over you, and they've been powerful for a long time. And there's some reason because the blowback from one mole, could really cook the whole goose. But in order to change that kind of organization demands a leadership focus from the head of an agency and equal rank. So the rank and file must see the culture and incentives change to reflect the importance of cooperation and information sharing. Or, as I think a better way of looking at it is information access. People want to look at the information as not something they own, bureaucratically own in the government, but as something that should be shared presumptively and only should be held if necessary. Obviously not for super sensitive stuff. But the objective would be a Goldwater-Nichols type transformation in the well, I shouldn't use that word, creation of a sort of purple sense, which is a blending of the agencies, such that officers at the alphabet soup, CIA, NSA, NGA, NRO, DIA, et cetera, think of themselves as members of a community as well as members simply of an agency to which they're very loyal. So that's the first part. A second part is more to do with the technical stuff, and I'm going to be a little vague here, but it's rationalizing management of the major programs. And I think this is a particular obligation of the DNIs. He's got to rationalize the resource allocation for these major programs in conformity with national needs, as opposed to the bureaucratic deals among the agencies, which I think is how things too much happen in the past, obviously with some notable exceptions. But this means that the DNI needs to have a more powerful role in making program decisions. Naturally, the DNI will have to work with people like the Secretary of Defense to determine what these key capabilities are in order to achieve our national objectives. But the key will be to develop criteria and to push these programs through in a way that's responsive to national leadership, not bureaucratic inertia. Let me be a little specific. I think this is going to go against strong agency inclinations to say, hey, maybe we need to field less complicated, less glamorous capabilities, but perhaps ones that are more survivable, redundant, or flexible. You can see this in the military context where he obviously made a lot of mistakes, but Secretary Rumsfeld canceled the Crusader program, or there's been the recent cancellation of the big destroyer program. I don't know enough to say specifically about that, but basically saying, hey, maybe we need to think about these are programs that are built up through kind of Pentagon bureaucracy as opposed to what the nation really needs. Furthermore, though, the DNI is going to have to take a close look at how to pull these initiatives off successfully. Sophisticated technical programs have become increasingly complex, risky, expensive, and prolonged, as you can see in the Department of Defense. The elevation by DNI McConnell of a deputy for acquisition in particular is a promising move in this direction. More broadly, another focus I think will have to be, unfortunately, rebuilding levels of confidence and trust after what has been a very difficult last 7 years. The vast bulk, in my view, of the criticism of the intelligence community has been unjustified, or at least overblown, but some of it has been justified. And in any case, perceptions are often, especially in Washington, more important than the truth. The next DNI and the rest of the leadership of the intelligence community will want to spend time, as General Hayden in particular has done, rebuilding the community's capital stock with the Congress and the public. That said, though, I think the next leadership of the intelligence community, whether under a Democratic or Republican administration, must stick to its guns on the tough issues. A lot of critics have taken a free ride on the Bush administration's many real mistakes to score easy but unfair points on much tougher and real issues. I'm thinking here of questions like what the boundaries of interrogation should be, on the detention of dangerous persons, on ensuring our surveillance capabilities are adequate to meet the challenges of a resourceful and ruthless enemy adept at using modern technology. The next DNI and chiefs of the CIA and the other agencies need to be honest, professional, and realistic to the next president by saying, sir, there are real trade-offs out there. The Bush administration may have done many things wrong, but these issues just won't go away because we brief Congress or get authorization. They are real tough questions that we need to think hard about. I think a good example of this is George Tenet, who, if people are familiar with, but is a Democrat, says in his memoirs that the interrogation program, the terror surveillance program, and a financial tracking program provided more valuable intelligence on the terrorist issue than all the rest of the government's intelligence combined. That means probably, at the very least, there are very significant trade-offs involved. So I think that's going to be the obligation to think seriously and forthrightly about this. And I think, of course, terrorism is going to have to continue to be a focus, especially the applicability of deterrence to terrorism. So let me conclude by emphasizing that intelligence reform must first and foremost maintain a sense of proportion, of the limited possibilities of intelligence. Contingency and surprise are irremovable elements of the system of governments. The Butler Report, the British version of the commission that I worked on, the American WMD Commission, began its report with a wise quotation from Clausewitz. Much of the intelligence that we receive in war is contradictory. Even more of it is plain wrong, and most of it is fairly dubious. What one can require of an officer under these circumstances is a certain degree of discrimination, which can only be gained from knowledge of men and affairs and from good judgment. The law of probability must be his guide. If the American intelligence reform effort takes this wisdom as its guiding principle, then there is reason to think that our intelligence establishment will be able to meet the great challenges of the new world of threats that we are facing. But it will never overcome them entirely. In my view, the intelligence community's mantra should not be that the truth will make us free, but that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Charlie. Give Charlie a microphone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to do this. I have to be at South Station and catch a bus by 5:15, and I'm very grateful. I want to go right to Mr. Colby and to thank you for a very stimulating presentation. And with a minimum of kind of whereases before I get to the now therefore, let me just say simply, perhaps I assume that one of the objectives of Messrs. Bin Laden and Zawahiri is to have us make a massive strike against them that would cause a lot of collateral damage to our effort in the global war on terror. I like the analysis down to the point when you get to dealing with something like that. So here's the now therefore. We do not find out that they have developed a capability to hit us extremely hard. It doesn't, some nuclear thing, something like that. They do a mega 911 on us. What is our response?
I mean, that's a tough question, obviously, and I'm going to caveat it by saying, obviously, it would depend on the circumstances and so forth and so on. I do think
I'd like to
just go right to the.
No, I'm not hemming you in. I'd like to get it in terms of that strategy that you.
So I actually didn't go into
that
it.
It is a deterrent strategy. How do we deter effectively?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because I actually cut a little section out about this. But my view is the terrorism problem is just a nettlesome problem in general. So I think we should start out by thinking that no strategy will perfectly deal with the very, very difficult problem of people who are really insistently and quite intelligently looking to do a lot of us harm. So the question, my view is that deterrence can work, but we have to think about deterrence in a more expansive sense. And I don't want to sound like Dr. Strangelove there, but is basically taking actually some insights from our domestic context, for instance, in tort law, for instance, and a way that we deal with a society in which governments cannot impose sufficient order to on a given sector, like the federally administered tribal area. What has been the traditional response and what has been an effective response? My view is that, and actually the administration has taken some steps in this direction, is that we need to expand the scope of the deterrent threats in the sense of expanding the people who have responsibility and who would be subject to deterrence. Now, when I say deterrence, that shouldn't mean we're necessarily going to drop an atomic bomb. There's very few cases in which we'd obviously want to do something like that. But it means that we have to change people's attitudes in places like Pakistan such that on an individual level, a border guard, a passport forger, etc., will think that he himself and other things that he values will be held at risk if he cooperates knowingly or even potentially with a significant degree of negligence in something that results in a catastrophic terrorist attack on the United States. The alternative, in my view, is a kind of never-ending attempt at prevention, which in my view has dangerous tendencies towards an absolutist form of government because, in a sense, if you're saying deterrence will never work against terrorist groups, the logic is that we have to watch everybody all the time. I think, to me, the question is, obviously it's some balance in between. Fundamentally, I would prefer to come down on the deterrent side and say we believe fundamentally that not everybody necessarily, but enough people to prevent an attack like that, or we can affect the calculuses of the relevant people in between somebody wishing he had an atomic bomb to blow up in America and that actually happening. And that's the way to do it, but that people aren't thinking like that. Clearly in Pakistan right now, people think the Americans, they don't even come into the Fatah because when a couple of these Frontier Corps guys lose a couple shots off. So we're clearly not very intimidating at this point.
Okay, this doesn't have to be on his record. I'll get your email from you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll send you something.
Thank you, Bill, for letting me
Okay,
talk.
thank you for coming.
Thank you for a great program, for all of you.
Great to have you here.
I'm very grateful.
when you mentioned an element of deterrent, that reminds me of a 1980s case where Soviet diplomats were kidnapped in Lebanon. And what happened was that the Spetsnaz came in and kidnapped the kidnappers' relatives and so on. And eventually, the Soviet ambassadors were released because the kidnappers had this stake in the game itself. So when you mention deterrent, do you mean something on a personal scale towards the terrorists?
I mean, that's obviously that would be pretty extreme, but especially at that scale. But I would say that you need to think about first of all, let's not just assume that let's think about what is it that a terrorist group is, right? It's not just bin Laden. It's a lot of people working together on a common enterprise, right? So a lot of those people probably can be deterred. The Israelis have had a lot of, actually, despite the fact they regularly get bombed, they don't get bombed in really, really significant ways. So they believe in deterrence, right? Second of all, deterrence doesn't just mean people say, well, you can't deter suicide bombers. Well, that's not necessarily the question. You can't deter a suicide bomber by holding a gun to his head. But there may be other ways you can deter him. What if you, for instance, here's a general way, what if you can deter him from achieving his objectives? You say, if the United States is hit with a WMD attack, we're going to change our policies X way on the Middle East or something like that, right? That's a very theoretical way of putting it. But what if he holds certain things at value? He has a favorite house or something like that, or a favorite cultural artifact that he owns or something, right? I mean, those are sort of banal, but you have to think about it on all the different axes instead of just, will it work to say I will hurt this individual if he does this? That's only the beginning, and I think when combined with defenses like nuclear detection and the threat of prevention, that if we know you're about to come at us, we'll do something.
Question for, I think, pretty much everybody who's spoken. And it starts with an acknowledgement that one of the sponsors of this wonderful afternoon, for which I think we're all thankful, is the Carnegie Council on Ethics. And I'd like to hear people talk about how ethics and the CIA go together, or does it come down to, at the end of the day, the ends justifying the means?
Good question. And something certainly that, having been in management positions as well as a case officer that I've dealt with extensively, I think I always start with the basic proposition, don't do things that go against the grain of the American people. And by that I mean when you hear stories, even given that it was in the 1950s on using LSD, something like that is just absolutely absurd. Or locking Nosenko up for 2.5 years down at the farm, something that, actually that was an interesting thing in the book. It noted that was under the authority of the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy. I think certainly I've been in positions where you have, especially in a situation after 9/11, or in a tension, crisis situation, tends to bring out the zealots and the opportunists, and that's when you've got to resist, and that's not easy. Because it's like a wave almost, and you can easily wind up drowning in that wave, and then it's later on that people start thinking about these things. But on some of the issues that are very much in the press regarding rendition, as well as enhanced interrogation techniques, it was a fully briefed program, under the law, and I think that's something that you have to note. But at the same time, it could also have been something where some people might have questioned some of these actions, and should have, in my opinion. That is very, very, very much my opinion. Now, on that same level, it's also used politically. On both sides of the equation. So I think that ethics thing is really, really important. And again, I think my bottom line is not to go, not to go against the grain of your own people. And I'm thinking of things like, Watergate and Iran-Contra, you kind of wonder what was President Nixon thinking, and this is something, he's a lawyer. He's a good lawyer, as a matter of fact. All you have to do is read some of his speeches in the Congress. And carrying out things like this, I find is kind of the my bottom line on ethical questions. I think they're very important.
Yeah, I actually I think the moral element is absolutely vital, and I think it's, and I'm not just saying that because Joel's here. I think it's really, really important, but I think it's important in a way that doesn't necessarily cut as people tend to sort of reflexively assume. I think that let's take the interrogation or detention issues just to take an example. A lot of people assume that they take a sort of, I think, a kind of like a hard line perspective that certain things are sort of to be ruled out, or that intelligence, like the gathering of secret intelligence through deception, for instance, is inherently wrong. I don't think that's correct, and I think there's actually something of a kind of moralistic laziness that Weiner in particular is vulnerable to. He sort of says, well, we should get more intelligence, but doing these things is inherently wrong, so therefore we should get the intelligence through some ways that satisfies this moral criterion and effectiveness. But this is not accepting the trade-offs that are invariably part of it. My view is that there are, and actually you also see it, I think, with people who, for instance, one thing that really, really irritates me is people who make arguments about, well, we should have something be illegal and it's wrong, but if it has to be done, some poor GS-13 should make the decision, and then somebody can defend him in a court of law. To me, that is an abdication not only of morality, but of the very principle of Republican government, which is that we are a nation under law. That doesn't mean that everything is written out in advance, but it means the people are going to think about what is right and wrong in a broad sense in advance, and their representatives, and they'll make a considered moral judgment, and then we'll go with it. People who make that kind of an argument, I think, are basically saying you can't grapple morally. My view is there are plausible moral answers to questions like interrogation, detention, surveillance, intelligence capabilities, covert action, et cetera, that may be pretty tough. Deterrence, nuclear deterrence is another great example. In my view, nuclear deterrence can be moral. It's not pretty, it's not nice, it doesn't make you feel good, but that doesn't mean it's immoral. And I think people who say, well, these things that we have to do, they should be immoral and ruled out. This is not really grappling with the issues, and it's not a really serious moral perspective. So I think it's important, but I think it might lead down paths people don't necessarily want to go.
I think what you especially got to watch out for is not painting yourself into corners, and saying one thing and doing another. I know that the Department of State every year issues a human rights report, and it gives countries a grade. I completely disagree with our right to grade other countries on their human rights. But I did note to CTC, our counterterrorism, I said, it's a problem when we give somebody a D or an F and we send somebody there. I'm not saying that it's illegal. It's not. But it's a problem. And our tendency has, especially recently, is to kind of paint ourselves into corners on these things, to say one thing and then to do another. I mean, that's you can be a real politica, realist, real politics. That's all right, but you can't kind of keep going, whenever you want to. And I think that it kind of hurts our credibility. So, if you're going to be a realist, be a realist. I note in the Weiner book, one of the things that was very interesting, looking back, he notes, how many corrupt governments that we've supported, noting Sigmund Rhee, Chiang Kai-shek. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, because it is true, but it was realistic. It was the only thing we could do. And, 40 years later, both those countries are prosperous. They're actually fairly democratic. They have a rule of law. And, it's no longer Maoist China. And Chiang Kai-shek, didn't kill that great a percentage of his population as Mao did. And North Korea is an absolute disaster, So, I think there's a good argument to make for realism. The problem is if you keep getting yourselves into those corners, they're very hard to get out. And I don't know why we do that.
Some years ago, one of the colleges across the river asked me to write a paper about ethics and morality and intelligence. And I looked into the literature that existed, and there was none on intelligence, but there was considerable literature on ethics and morality in the military. There are, of course, ethical rules for physicians and ethical rules for lawyers, and I thought, shouldn't there be ethical rules for intelligence officers? So I constructed something in this paper. It's in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, if you want to look it up, about how intelligence officers should behave in terms of ethical values. And one of the rules is that while you have to lie to other people because you're undercover or because you're trying to get something done, you can't lie internally to each other. You have to tell the truth to your bosses, otherwise the whole system collapses. The second rule is that you are guardians of the public's money, even though it's secret. And clearly we could cheat, given the nature of how we do things. But it's not your money. Third thing is you have to tell truth to power. Well, they don't like that. But that's part of the deal. And the fourth thing is that you can't complain publicly. You can't, we're sworn to secrecy, which is understandable. And what this means is that while you think things are really wrong, and you have to work at them on the inside, you can't or shouldn't go out and carry out a crusade against your own people in public. Although a number of people have done it, but I think that's quite wrong. And so there are a couple more of these, but that's basically my approach to it. And as it turns out, the agency after that began actually teaching a course on ethics and morality in what's known as CIA 101. That's what all the new hires get when they sign on.
I'd just like to briefly add that I think there's a spectrum, an ethical or a moral spectrum. On one end, perhaps, is bribery, which has to be done, and everybody does it. I suppose you can think of it as immoral, but it doesn't keep me up at night. And then you move along the spectrum to the LSD experiments and so forth, and that's a little more problematic. On the extreme is assassination. And here I think that, for me at least, the criterion ought to be, proportionality here. What is the threat? Obviously, bin Laden is a threat, and if anybody can knock him off, I can't imagine anybody objecting to it on ethical grounds. But then you get to, for example, Operation Mongoose. How much of a threat was Fidel Castro to the United States? How much of a threat was Lumumba to the United States? In that case, I don't know if that's unique or not, where the station chief puts the toxin in his safe and doesn't use it. Lumumba gets killed anyway, but it's not by the CIA, not least directly. So to me, assassination is the litmus test here. Obviously, the Israelis use it, targeted assassination, but that's because they are directly under threat. So when it comes to be a question of someone we don't like, who might be a threat in the future, that I think is more of an ethical challenge.
Let me add, actually, you bring up an interesting thing, the Lumumba thing, and it's Larry Devlin was the chief of station there, who, by the way, is still alive. He's walking around with his oxygen tank, but he's probably getting close to 90 right now. And I agree, and as he describes it in his own memoirs, he got this stuff, and then he kind of papered it to death, and didn't use it because he thought it was really stupid. I think probably a way that you'd like to change the culture is for him to write a cable saying, "This is really stupid." Now, what would happen, Art? You know, and you know that is you know, that articulation. I think is really important. Now, you know, Larry was a very successful senior officer and a very, very good senior officer as well. But I think there probably needs to be a little bit more of that, not only in our institution, but state, military, and probably, for all I know, housing and health and human services, and et cetera, is that you articulate these type of arguments and that people then think about them instead of reacting.
If I could say, I seem to be holding the mic. So, Joel and I, we met, 15, 18 years ago. We at the time, I thought I was an ethicist, and we did a conference at the University of British Columbia on ethics and international affairs, led to a book, and so on and so forth. But over time, I've actually become a historian, sort of by osmosis in a way. And I think that this project of articulation of ethical codes and consciously thinking about it and institutionalizing it, this is critical. It's the process of civilization and law and good government and decency and all of that. But as an historian, I'm sorry, I think that your ethics are contextual to the ethics of your enemy. And that the ruthlessness and the the lack of ethics of your enemy will also drive yours down. I think that is just a statement of fact, historical fact, rather than speculation. Think of how the United States behaved in World War II. We didn't have fine arguments and distinctions about interrogation. We beat the hell out of every Nazi we could get a hold of and found out operational information and used it. Obviously that's the extreme case because it was the biggest war ever fought and so forth. But I do think the retrospective worries and nuances about how we behaved during the Cold War, that's fine. That's important. That's because it's a decent people having a decent conversation about what it means to be decent. But we were fighting an indecent enemy, and they got into the sewer, and yes, you have to go down to a certain extent with them. I think the same is true now with Al-Qaeda, and I think it will be ever so, if I can leave the historian's hat and look into the future for a moment. I
think you know the Doolittle statement in 1954. I think summarizes that very, very well. I think Art, he was head of a commission that looked into this for Eisenhower, and he notes that very strongly. We're going to have to get down to that level, but there are still limits. I mean. You know, on things like, what we called covert action light, which was basically presenting the U.S. view. I mean, I was very strongly in favor of always sticking to the truth as far as you can tell it. I mean, it's not an absolute thing, you know. But there are, we're very powerful. I mean, nobody's been as powerful as us. I noted that Bill used the word threat. These guys threaten us. They certainly don't threaten our country or institutions. They threaten American lives and property, which we're beholden to protect. You know, we're very strong, and I think you can. It's not like we have our backs to the walls, and that's one of the things I think that separates us from other intelligence services like the Brits and the French and the Israelis, which have a kind of, a tremendous support, and there isn't that ambivalence and that questioning and so on. And there was a time when I used to think we over-question and so on and so forth. But that's also, as I used to say up on the 7th floor, hey guys, we're Americans. Can't forget that.
Right.
Good.
But I was just, it struck me, the gentleman's left, who made the point about what is the phrase he used? Basically 9/11 to the power of 10, something like that, a dirty bomb or something in New York. And I would say also if it happened in Paris or Moscow or Beijing, I'm sorry, that happens, someone's country is going to disappear. Whatever deterrent theory you have, whatever fine ethical, Joel, all due respect, whatever fine ethical systems that have been worked out in advance, as much as I regret that conclusion, I think that is the most likely outcome of that. And maybe even more so if it's Paris. But
Hope it's not Paris.
No. No?
Yeah.
Yeah, but-
Yeah, go ahead. Up there.
Just one final comment. I hope that in the intelligence community, as in many other aspects of American life, that the dynamic between doing things the ethical way and doing things that get the result needed never stops. I was in Vietnam for a couple of years, and towards the end of it, I was part of something called the Phoenix program, which several of you may be familiar with, and we were always told that basically the end justified the means. It didn't really work out that well. But I hope the dialogue never stops in all of this. Otherwise, we stop being the kind of people that we think we really should be. And thank you all.
Hi, yes. Just two sort of related questions. The first one is, Bridge, you mentioned something about money and limited resources going forward, and then sort of mentioned covert action just in passing. And I know in the 1950s, when you had brinksmanship as being sort of the dominant policy, certainly there's a lot of money put into covert action because it is seen as a good value for American interests. So the question is, in the sort of a future world of scarcity, would that mean that covert action would make more sense? Obviously trying to avoid the mistakes of the past and learn from the past, but is there a real place for covert action in the future? And if so, what does that mean about regulation, government regulation? You see from the little I know, and I certainly know very little about this, but in Afghanistan and Iraq, the tendency of the Department of Defense to try and take on more intelligence gathering and also covert action sort of operations as a way of circumventing some of the shackles that may be placed on the Central Intelligence Agency. And basically, and that ties into the question of, so what does that mean for the structure of intelligence going forward? Does the structure of intelligence also need to be rethought? I mean, Bridge, you mentioned the sort of the bureaucratic tendencies to slow things down, and yet the desire to sort of your solutions were, well, we got to go make bureaucracy better, even though you started off by saying bureaucracy is inherently inefficient. So does that mean that do we just need to are putting Band-Aids just not the right thing? Do we really need to rethink this more deeply?
I think great questions. Let me start at the second point, which is I think bureaucracies are not particularly efficient, but they're what we have. The trade-off is if we create a new organization, it's got a huge learning curve. It's going to have growing pains. It's going to get taken out to lunch a few times. I think the historical record would suggest that the OSS was actually not a very successful operational organization. The early years of the CIA were disastrous. Almost all of the operations behind the Iron Curtain, as well as in East Asia, they almost all failed. So, Senator McCain, for instance, calls for a new OSS kind of thing, but I'm instinctively very skeptical about that. I think, we got an organization that exists, has established relationships, as training. Yes, it kind of maybe becomes sort of more settled in its ways and so forth. But I think people, when they see a problem, especially in Washington, they say, let's reorganize. It's sort of the easiest thing to do. It's what Congress has power over. It can actually make more of an impact, so they tend to go that way, like the 9/11 Commission did that. But often the problem is is more within the system and sort of that, and that's what I think we need to pay more attention to. On the question of covert action, let me phrase it a little differently. I do think that we cannot expect that our sort of main force conventional forces will give very high returns over the next generation, other than as a deterrent. Like, we want to have them around so the North Koreans don't get the idea that they can get away with taking Seoul, right? But they're not going to be very useful in the Fatah or something like that. I would say that limited and tailored action will be very useful, and we'll want to have as many capabilities as possible to do that at a reasonable cost. It won't necessarily be covert. I think one of the lessons is that it's not always good to be covert because you're hiding. And actually, I think, for instance, the president's now spoken about it, but for instance, on interrogation, I think the United States should have said, this is what we're going to do. I'm not saying I agree with all of the decisions. I mean, I would definitely be for something that's more restricted. But the United States should say, we feel this is necessary. I think the question about proportionality to me is whether you think, at what degree of generality you think the proportionality kicks in. I would tend to think the proportional threat on the whole, so something like World War II is high, you're allowed to do a lot. But the question is, let's be open about something, but it doesn't mean that we have to use big tanks and B-52s. It means, you can train local forces, and you can see the government's doing this and investing a lot in sending people to train the Ethiopians or whatever, and those kind of capabilities are absolutely going to be necessary over the coming years.
You mentioned in your talk about the Russian attack, a cyber attack on one of its neighbors. Would you consider a cyber attack? Would you consider that a covert action, or is that an attack that you'd place under the realm of the conventional military forces? And how do you see the internet and sort of information operations in general? Certainly, they've changed a lot over the past few decades. And how has that sort of convoluted the relationship between traditional militaries and the role of the intelligence communities? I think here in the United States, certainly, we haven't really hashed out as to where, information operations, specifically cyber, whether it really falls under the traditional military realm or in one of the intelligence agencies.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think whether it's a covert action depends on. I assume this is the issue in question. I think is a covert action because the Russians denied it, right? So it's sort of by necessity a covert action. It's clearly not conventional in the sense it's not the use of conventional munitions against an opponent, but it might rise to the level of an act of war. I mean, I don't think in this case we need to go there, but you could certainly conceive it. I think cyber. I'm serving as an advisor on a government congressional commission right now, and I'm going to go do some meetings next week to talk to people about what are the what. And I should add, obviously, I'm speaking in my own capacity here, not for them, but. What are the sort of disruptive or kind of transformational kind of technologies that we're looking at? And I think cyber is a great example. That kind of thing doesn't just cut between intelligence and the military, but when does the Army begin and the Air Force start? In a sense, where do the services mean? How do they meld together? And I think it's a tough question. One of the things that I think, particularly for cyber, I don't know nearly enough to comment on it too much, but one of the things I do see that I'm encouraged about with the Secretary Gates is the move towards the kind of taking the Air Force away from the reign of the fighter generals and moving more towards a little bit wonkier kind of technocrat approach, because I think the Air Force is probably the best repository. It's probably the most flexible of the services. I know the Navy's gotten some good marks in the last few years, but the Army and the Navy tend to be more wedded to their traditional ways. The Air Force, because it's younger, because it's sort of a more, it's not necessarily as rooted in a kind of capability, it tends to be a little more flexible. And I think that's probably the kind of place where you would want to have the centers of excellence on things like cyber. You'd clearly want that capability and the knowledge about it in the intelligence community as well, because you've got to have the intelligence, gathering and analyzing capabilities roped in as quickly as possible, especially if we're going to be moving towards like the future combat system and these things where we're basically relying on sort of instantaneous information to have advantages over our enemies. So I'm not really answering your question, but I think that I would say I would probably look to the Air Force in particular for that kind of expertise, hopefully, but the Navy as well, because on the maritime side.
I think we have time for one more comment or question. You're the guy.
I get to be the last one. One thing that has not been mentioned that often during the discussion is the corporate influence on the actions and the planning and the strategy that the agency or even intelligence community undertakes. And all of you looking back throughout the entire history of CIA, considering the fact that Dulles and Donovan themselves were lawyers from Wall Street, and the influence of ITT in Chile, looking back at the history of CIA and what is happening now, how would you comment the corporate influence?
I think the CIA is often portrayed up through 1989 as being fixated on the Soviet Union, in which, and by the way, as far as a percentage of the intelligence budget, it's always been a very small part, and an even smaller part for the Directorate of Operations or the National Clandestine Service has been very, very small, as a matter of fact. But it's always been portrayed as fixated on the Soviet Union. I really don't think that's necessarily true. I think it was a pretty globally oriented agency. It engaged in a lot of intelligence collection, but certainly the covert action part of it was directed toward the Soviet Union. And then it was thought after 1989 that it had lost, so to speak, an enemy. And Americans like to think of friends and enemies, and so on. And there was a peace dividend and a cutback in a lot of areas. And I think then we went into things like proliferation, which became more important, terrorism, counter-narcotics, and so on. And that became the main emphasis. It is interesting that when Woolsey was in his nomination process, he did his most. I think it'll be the most quotable thing any director of Central Intelligence ever said. We've slain the dragon, but there's a lot of poisonous serpents out there. And he's thinking about proliferation. He's thinking about rogue states like North Korea and Iran and so on. But I think it became actually far less global and less of a collection of intelligence type of agency. And then you have the 9/11 period, which then concentrated very, very strongly on terrorism and on those big four that I mentioned, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Iran. I think that's too limited, but that's what the policymaker wants and needs right now.
I would say, I just on the corporate issue, I don't think that it's very important, and maybe I'm too skeptical. But I think my experience, which is far more limited, obviously, but in my experience, that's not really where people are oriented. People are oriented to their leadership in the intelligence community and to the president and the White House, and then they're oriented to the Congress. And people who work at the CIA, they usually live in Northern Virginia. It's not like there are people coming down with bags of money from like Goldman Sachs to handle. It's just not really. And people, and in my experience, people who work
don't
in
have any money.
Yeah, exactly. You notice, right? People
owe money.
People in my experience, these are like dedicated public servants. These are people who are this is what they do for a living. And I think even historically, I think that this has been said before, but the Church Commission. Church was hell-bent on proving that the agency was a rogue elephant. At the end, he said, oh, geez, actually, they were just doing what the presidents wanted. So if you think there's corporate influence in American politics, we could argue about that, but I think then you got to go and check out 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
I just add very quickly that the two cases that is most often used to claim that corporate influence affects the CIA were the Operation Ajax, success in Guatemala, because the Dulles brothers had worked for United Fruit or advised United Fruit. And then in Chile, you mentioned ITT and so forth. My sense of it, that was really had minimal influence on the decisions to move in those areas. Yes, they were there, but it certainly did not determine the decision to go in and take out Arbenz or to take out Allende. Okay, well, before you leave, I just want to remind you that we do have a reception coming up. For those of you that don't want to check your 401ks or find out what bank is
gone, right?
what bank has failed in the afternoon, we're having a reception out here. But I wanted to thank.
You don't know Washington Mutual anything.
No, that's right. Yeah. So I wanted to thank all of our panelists, Art and Joe and Bridge, for a wonderful afternoon, and Joel for being so supportive. And thank all of you as well.